Hello, everyone. Welcome to the HPL seminar this week. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Fabian Hoitz. Fabian started his undergraduate in 2011 at the Technical University of Darmstadt in Germany in the program of Sports and Computer Science. After he achieved a Bachelor's of Science degree in 2014, he started his master's course at the Otto von Guericke University of Magdeburg under the supervision of Dr. Anita Hokelman and Dr. Benno Nigg. During his master's, he specifically worked on investigating changes in muscle activity as a response to changes in joint movements of the lower extremities, and he achieved the Master's of Science degree in 2018. Then he came to here to the University of Calgary for continuing his research as a PhD student under the supervision of Dr. Benno Nigg and Dr. Art Kuo. Currently, he's been working on various projects, including movement characteristics related to gait recognition, developing a virtual coaching system for hockey players, and detecting real-time movement using neural networks. Recently, Fabian won a few funding competitions, including MyTech's Accelerate Scholarship and Alberta Innovates. When I asked him about interesting or fun facts aside from academic background, he wanted to share a quick story with us. So before he started his master's, but after he graduated his bachelor's degree, he worked at a farm located in the Lofoten Island in Norway. And one day there was a huge storm and the power went off for about a week. So he experienced a complete isolation from the rest of the world because he wasn't able to send any texts, make a call, or sending an email. After that week, and he came back to online world and checking his message and emails and phones, and then realized that no one actually had sent any message to him for that week. To me, it is a little sad story, and not sure why he thinks it's kind of funny still. I'll have to grab Fabian to talk about this more. But before that, Fabian will be giving a talk today entitled as Individuality Decoded by Gait. All yours, Fabian.
Oh, thank you, Songwon. Now, a year ago, I presented here in the HPL seminar. And back then, the presentation was somewhat different because I didn't really have any data to present. All I could present was my PhD proposal and the idea of what I wanted to look into. So I'm especially excited to be back here today, about a year later, because now I finally have some data and I can follow through on the ideas that I presented earlier. Now, my research is relatively straightforward. We believe that human gait can be broken down into a generic component and one or multiple specific components. And when I say components here, what I actually mean are movement characteristics. Thus, the generic component of gait we can imagine to be the most generic movement pattern that all humans share. So in other words, it does not encode any information as to who we are as individuals. Now, if we look at the stick figure here on the right, we can see that this is clearly a human walking. But what we're lacking is any type of information as to whether or not this is a male or a female, a young or an elderly individual, or a healthy or an injured individual. So this we can envision to be the most generic human movement pattern there can be. The specific components of human gait, on the other hand, would be those movement characteristics that encode our individuality, or that encode information about specific functional groups, like for example, males and females. Now I have two more stick figures here, and we can clearly see that the person on the left is a female person walking, and the person on the right is a male person walking. And there are a few cues that help us to determine that. So for instance, if we look at the shoulders of these two people, we can see that the shoulder sway for the female is barely existing, while the male person has a very extensive shoulder sway. Other cues would include the positioning of the elbows. For the female person, they are very close to the torso, and for the male person, they're very far spread apart. And also the sway of the hip. So we would see a strong hip sway for the female person and a relatively non-existent hip sway for the male person. So these specific components of gait then represent these cues that I just highlighted that determine our individuality or the specific movement characteristics of one functional group. Now, like I said, I had a whole study plan and I was all ready to get going, but then unfortunately COVID-19 happened and everything shut down and I couldn't collect any data. Luckily, I'm not the first PhD student with Benno, and I had a lot of projects to sort through and see if there was anything available to me that I can look into and that I can use to identify and quantify those generic and specific components of human gait. And I came about a study that was done by Jennifer Baltic back in 2016. She was a PhD student with Benno, and she defended on the effects of resistance strength training and functional strength training on risk factors for running injuries. After a longer Skype session, Jen was relatively kind and allowed me to use her data, but you could still argue that whatever she was doing is not necessarily related to what I wanted to do. Her data, however, was very perfect for my purposes. So from Jen's data set, I could isolate 50 participants for whom I could use the data. She had participants run overground here in the HPL main lab at 3.3 meters per second, and she had 2 collection days that were spread 8 weeks apart. During those 8 weeks, Jen's participants all underwent one of 3 training interventions. So we would have a group that would do a strength protocol, a strengthening protocol. We had a group that would receive a balance training, more of a functional balance training. And then we had one control group that received no training at all. Now for each participant and at each collection day, Jen collected about 20 steps, and we obtained kinematic and kinetic data for that as she used the motion analysis system and the Kistler force plate. So with this data set in place, I then designed about 3 purposes that I wanted to look into with this specific data set. Now, the first purpose was to see if we could perform gait recognition on the post-intervention data. So the data that was collected on the second day, 8 weeks after the first day. For this gait recognition task, we would use a mathematical model, in our case, an artificial neural network. And the idea was then to see if we could identify those variables. And when I say variables here, I actually mean like individual data points in our kinematic and kinetic data set. So we wanted to see if we could identify those variables that were most relevant to the task of gait recognition, the variables that influenced the decision-making of the neural network the most. And then the last idea that we wanted to explore was to see if we could reduce our data set to a certain point where we would have less variables that we need, but we would still experience about a similar performance. So we would not have to sacrifice any accuracy in our gait recognition. And for today's talk, I will walk you through each of these purposes one by one, and I will share each result one by one. So this will hopefully be interesting. Now, gait recognition describes the process of identifying an individual simply based on their movement behavior. And in our case, a movement behavior was described by an individual step pattern. Now, when I say step pattern, what I actually mean are 1,200 variables or data points that represented a single step. And these 1,200 variables were derived from 3D joint angle trajectories of the hip, knee, and ankle, and the three-dimensional ground reaction forces. Now, to put that a little bit more into perspective, we would normalize our movement trajectories to stance phase, and we would time normalize it to exactly 100 values. So per trajectory, we would have 100 data points, 100 variables. And as we have 12 trajectories in total, so each joint angle trajectory has 3 directions and the ground reaction forces have 3 directions. So as we have 12 trajectories in total, we had 1,200 individual data points, individual variables that would express a single step. Now, I mentioned earlier that we received or obtained about 20 steps per day and per participant. That meant that we obtained about 2 data sets of comparable size. I tried to highlight that here a little bit by saying that we have 1 data set for day 1, which consists of about 1,000 steps, so about 20 steps per participant with 50 participants. And then the 1,200 variables as our data points for 1 step pattern. And we would have a matrix of comparable size for day 2, so the post-intervention day. And with these 2 data sets kind of set up, we then went about and designed our neural network. Now, specifically, we chose a shallow neural network. What people often hear about are deep neural networks. Those are relatively sophisticated. A shallow neural network, on the other hand, is a lot more simplistic. Specifically here, we had only 3 layers. So a network consists of 3 layers. 1 input layer, which represented the individual data points in our step patterns. So we had 1,200 nodes. We would have 1 hidden layer that had twice the size of nodes, so 2,400. And then we would have a single output layer representing the 50 participants we had in our data set. The activation function we used for our neural network was the hyperbolic tangent, which is a commonly used activation function for neural networks. So nothing special there. Now, after we designed the network and we set up the architecture, we then trained the network on the data of day 1. So we would take the entire matrix that I highlighted here and just expose it to the network and ask it to basically set its internal parameters so that it would be able to recognize individuals based on their gait patterns. And after the training process, we naturally needed to validate our network. So we would use the data of day 2 to see how accurate could our model actually predict the individual a gait pattern belonged to. And this accuracy we expressed as a ratio of correctly matched stride patterns over the total number of stride patterns. And this is what I highlighted here in this first graph. So this is the first result of this study. On the y-axis, we see the accuracy expressed in percentage. So 100% meaning all steps were correctly assigned to the correct individual. And on the x-axis here, we see the individual participants. So we broke it down for every single one of them. The color coding of this graph represents our 3 intervention groups. So we have the balance group, the functional balance training in blue. We have the strength training in red. And then we have the control group represented here in yellow or orangish. Now, the first thing to notice about this result is that if we average the accuracy across all participants, our model performed quite well. So we had about a 96% accuracy for all 50 participants, which means it's quite the accurate model, actually. The second interesting thing was that although the general accuracy was that good, there seemed to be a few outliers here. So for instance, participant number 6 here and participant number 32, as well as 45 here. For those 3, the model seemed to not perform very well. Now, one possible explanation could be that those 3 participants in particular changed the gait pattern over those 8 weeks to a degree where the model was just not able to recognize them anymore. The somewhat interesting aspect with respect to the intervention groups, however, was that if participants actually changed their gait pattern, it was not in response to the intervention they received. Like, you can clearly see that these outliers are distributed across all 3 intervention groups. And this would suggest that the interventions themselves were unsuccessful in altering an individual's gait pattern. So this led us to kind of summarize that in our data, the gait patterns were unique and unperturbed, which is something that previous authors have also found. For instance, here, Horst and colleagues in 2017, I believe looked into the persistency of gait patterns over a 1-year period, and they found something similar. So this leads me to believe that William Shakespeare was onto something when he wrote that great Juno comes, I know her by her gait. Now, the second purpose was to look into the variables that were most influential for the decision of our neural network. And before I show you the heat map that shows this result, I have to talk a little bit about how we actually identified those variables. So if we imagine a pretty simple, pretty straightforward neural network, then this is often depicted as a graph like this. We would have nodes here represented in circles that show the individual layers. So we would have an input layer here on the first line. We would have a hidden layer here in the middle with 3 nodes. And then we would have an output layer here at the right-hand side representing the answer of the neural network. If we transfer that back to our data, then our input layer here on the left represents the 1,200 data points that we have. Our hidden layer represents some results that the neural network obtained after performing calculations on the input data. And the output layer would represent our 50 participants. So we would actually have 50 nodes here on the right-hand side, each representing 1 participant. And now the inner workings of a neural network are in a way where information is propagated from the input to the output. So we essentially say, here's a gait pattern. Now apply your learned parameters and calculations and tell me what participant does it belong to. So information goes from input to output. There is a technique that is called layer-wise relevance propagation, however, that turns this process around. So we would start on the right-hand side instead of the left-hand side. We would start with an output. So in our case, that could be participant number 5. The gait pattern we just used to classify belonged to participant number 5. So we would start with that output. And layer-wise relevance propagation then breaks this answer or this final result down to its individual contribution for the nodes in the previous layer. So in this example here, we would see that the node at the very bottom, the one that is shaded in a darker red, was very influential to the final output result, while the other 2 nodes here in the middle were not as influential. And we can apply this process again and again to every layer. And in this fashion, we would then finally end up in the very first, the input layer, to understand how influential was every single node or every single data point to the final decision of the network. So we would obtain a relevance score for every single variable in our data set. And this is what I try to depict here with this heat map. Now this graph is quite a lot to take in on the first side, so I will walk you through it like very slowly. First, on the top right side here, we have the respective relevance scores coded as a color. So lighter colors or white colors would represent a low relevance score. In other words, those data points that were not very important for our network's decision. And then in black or in dark blue, we would have those data points that were highly relevant to our, to our decision making, to the network's decision making. Now on the y-axis of this heat map, we have the individual trajectories that we used in our data. So we would have the hip trajectories in the coronal, sagittal, and transverse plane, followed by the knee trajectories, the ankle trajectories, and then finally the ground reaction forces. And all of those were normalized to stance, like we said. So we had 100 values, 1% of stance at each point for each trajectory. And the interesting thing to see here is that there are certain periods, here expressed in dark, that the network deemed as highly relevant to the decision making, or as highly relevant to classifying an individual. So I'm looking here at the hip coronal plane at about 20 to 30% of stance. But similarly, we could look at the hip transverse plane towards the end of stance phase around 90%, or also down here in the ground reaction forces, medial lateral, we have a few darker spots. Now, the other interesting part is that there are a few trajectories or a few data points that were not at all important to the network, or that were, relatively speaking, less relevant to the decision making. And a good example here is the hip sagittal plane, for instance. Generally, this is lightly colored. To condense this graph slightly, we decided to sum up the individual relevance scores in vertical and horizontal direction and express the contribution of each percentage of stance and the contribution of each trajectory to the final classification or to the identification of individuals. Now the top graph here shows the summation in the horizontal direction. So we can essentially identify how important is every individual percentage of stance to the decision-making of the neural network. And the first thing to see is that there is not just one single period that is important or one single period that is not important. In fact, every percentage of stance contributes something to the decision-making. However, it seems that the first 30% of stance in this example provided more information to the subject identification than the remaining 70% of stance. Now, a possible explanation here could be that we had various stride patterns in our data set. Like Jen did not control for rear foot or forefoot striking. So if there are, in fact, different strike patterns in the data, we would expect to see the difference more in the early phases of stance. If we look at the right-hand side here, we see the contributions of the individual trajectories. And what stands out is that there are 5 trajectories in particular that are very important to the decision-making. So we have, going from the bottom here, the medial lateral ground reaction forces, the transverse plane of the ankle, and then some in the knee and some in the hip here. The other trajectories that show a little bit of less relative contribution seem to be, generally speaking, less important or seem to encode less of our specific movement characteristics. Now, if we summarize the main finding of this graph, then we would learn that the most relevant trajectories when it comes to gait recognition are the hip up adduction and internal external rotation, the knee up adduction, the ankle in eversion, and the medial lateral ground reaction forces. Now, the last purpose was to see if we could reduce the data that we had to a point where we would still have a good performance, but we would not necessarily need all 1,200 data points for the classification task. So to kind of highlight how we went about, I bring back this heat map here. The beauty of these relevance scores is that we can rank the variables according to them. So for instance, we could isolate the one single variable that was most important to the neural network. And in this example here, it would be the coronal plane, the hip in the coronal plane at 25% of stance. And we could remove all other variables from our data and only keep this one and reclassify all of our steps and see what would that do to the accuracy of the model. And then we could go ahead and increase the number of variables we used. So we could add the second most relevant variable here and redo the classification process. And then we could add the third most relevant variable and redo the classification purpose. So in this fashion, we essentially reclassified 1,200 times the entire data to see what would happen to our accuracy. And this is the result of that approach. So on the y-axis, again, we see the accuracy of our model. And on the x-axis here, we see the number of variables that we used for the prediction. Now on the left-hand side here, so towards the 0, would be the variables that had the highest relevance scores. And then on the right-hand side here would be the variables that had the smallest relevance scores. And the interesting thing to see here is that the first 200 variables that we introduced or reintroduced into our data accounted for about 75% accuracy. So it seems that with quite the reduction of data points, we can still obtain quite the good end result. Interestingly, once we added another 100 data points here, we would get an increase in our accuracy, but the rate at which our accuracy would increase dropped a little. So the gain per variable was a lot slower or a lot smaller. And then after we had 300 variables in our data set, our network actually got confused and didn't really know what to do with additional variables. So the overall accuracy here dropped a little until we reached about, I'd say, 500 data points. So one explanation here could be for this little dip, could be that whatever information is contained within the first 300 variables is already enough, and additional information simply provides noise to the neural network that does not help the actual classification. Now, if we want to squeeze out the last percentages, we would then just continue on and add further variables. And we would see that we end up at these 96% accuracy once we included all variables. But the actual gain per additional variable is relatively small. Now, naturally, we were interested in a snapshot. We wanted to see, show me exactly what are those variables, those 200 variables here, that contribute the most amount of accuracy to our classification. And the following graph here highlights exactly that. We see that these 200 variables are distributed across the 5 trajectories that we highlighted earlier, which makes a lot of sense. So we have the hip coronal plane and transverse plane, the knee coronal plane, ankle transverse plane, and the medial lateral ground reaction forces. But we also see that these variables are distributed across the entirety of stance. So it's not just early stance that was important. In fact, it's the entire stance phase that was important. And it's not just one trajectory continuously. In fact, there are gaps within a trajectory where the data did not provide the high amount of information that we would need for gait classification. So the summary of this is essentially that gait patterns are unique and stable, and that what we call specific gait characteristics or unique movement patterns, these are largely contained within only 5 trajectories. And this is a little typo, this should be 75% accuracy. Anyhow, 75% accuracy can be achieved with about 200 variables only, which is quite the reduction in data when we consider that we started off with 1,200 variables. Now we had one more question. We wanted to know whether this approach of reducing the data was actually viable or if it's a good approach. And so we put it to the test and we brought in 4 other approaches to reduce the data for our classification task. So the graph here should look somewhat familiar. We have accuracy on the y-axis again, and the number of variables used on the x-axis. And the blue curve here, I labeled it as LRP for layer-wise relevance propagation, is the one we've already seen before. Now, the other approaches that we chose were a principal component approach, here in red, where we would take the entire data set that we had, and we would expose it to a principal component analysis, and then we would rank every variable according to its loading on only the first principal axis. And then we would select those variables and reclassify. And what we see is that the approach itself shows a similar behavior than the layer-wise relevance approach, but it doesn't work as well. So it seems that ranking variables according to variance, to the internal variance, which is what a principal component analysis does, is not as accurate as ranking variables according to layer-wise relevance propagation. The third one here in yellow was quite surprising to us because here we selected variables at random. We just chose a random number generator and we picked variables in whichever fashion the random number generator thought was good. And then we reclassified. And you can see that the general accuracy increases just slightly below the layer-wise relevance approach. But then once we reach about 200 to 300 variables, this approach actually performed a lot better, or maybe not a lot, but noticeably better. So that was quite surprising to us. The last two approaches here in purple and in green were simply an approach where we ranked the variables according to their appearance in our data. So if you remember the heat map, we would start at the top left and then fill the heat map up by going towards the right and then take the next step. So the purple line essentially says that first we included only hip variables, the first 100 hip variables, then the second 100 hip variables, and then the third. And once we had hip in there, we would take the knee in there, and then we would take the ankle and then the ground reaction forces. The green curve represents the opposite of that, where we started off at the bottom right of our heat map. So we would start off by including ground reaction force trajectories, followed by ankle trajectories, and then hip, and then knee, and finally hip. And you can see that both approaches performed relatively poor compared to the others. So that would suggest that only looking at one of these locations, joint locations, or only on the ground reaction forces, does not provide all the information that we would need. Now, we also wanted to create these snapshots that we've already seen before for these other approaches to get a visual of which variables are actually included. So here we see the graph that we've seen before, the layer-wise relevance propagation. And again, I want to highlight we have certain bands, and these bands are distributed across the entirety of stands. Now, if we go to the principal component analysis approach, we see that these bands of highly important variables are maintained, and we also maintain the temporal distribution, so over the x-axis of our graph. However, for the principal component analysis, the chosen variables are more so located towards the early phases of stands and less so towards the later phases of stands. So this is quite the difference towards the layer-wise relevance approach. We also see that there are different variables included. So for instance, here we have the sagittal plane for the knee and the transverse plane for the knee, which we did not have in the layer-wise relevance approach, which makes it clear that the two techniques choose different variables, which is good for our case. Now, here the purple curve, where we ordered variables in ascending order as they appeared in our data. So like I highlighted, we would only use hip variables at first, and 200 hip variables basically mean the coronal and the sagittal plane of the hip, which did not perform very well. And then at the descending order, where we would only use the ground reaction forces, here anterior, posterior, and vertical, did also not perform very well. Now, the last graph was the most interesting one. So here we selected variables completely at random. And you can see that they are distributed across the entirety of stands, and they are distributed across all trajectories that we had. We can also see that these bands that we had in the earlier graphs are completely disappeared. And yet, for some reason, this approach performs almost as good or even better than either the principal component or the layer-wise relevance approach. So the question then is, what does that mean for us as researchers? And it's still a little bit difficult to kind of wrap my head around it, but I would say that a neural network can work with whatever you throw at it, as long as it kind of spans the entire spectrum of your data. So we can select random variables that are distributed across the entire heat map, and we get good accuracies. The drawback of this, however, is that we would have to collect everything when we collect data. Now, the layer-wise relevance approach seems to narrow down to very specific variables with which we get a good accuracy or a comparable accuracy in our network, but it would make our data collection a lot more feasible because now we can actually focus on only the few trajectories that we actually need. So this is something to think about for the future when we design protocols and collect data. Now some limitations that this study or this approach clearly comes with is that all the results I've shown today are completely dependent on the data that we use. So in other words, the relevance scores that we obtained and that we used then to rank everything are a function of the internal parameters of the neural network. And the internal parameters of the neural network in turn are the function of the training data. So in our case, the data that was collected on the first day of Jen's protocol. So if we had a different data set, a different training data set, we would most likely get a different heat map. And I cannot speak to how that heat map would be different, but it would be interesting to see if there are any similarities or any differences, or any strong differences between the two. The other limitation is clearly sample size. We had 50 individuals, and we could argue that a neural network that is highly specialized to identify individuals based on their gait would not have a difficult time doing that in a population of 50 individuals. If we, however, had about 2,000 or 4,000 individuals, this task might become more difficult. We might need way more variables than 1,200. And again, the resulting heat map, the resulting layer-wise relevance scores would look probably entirely different. Now, the beauty of these limitations is that we can actually work on them. We can actually design our next steps to explore the specific and generic gait characteristics across different populations and see if there's something in particular that seems to be similar so that we have a final ground truth, or if it's all just a fluke of the data. With that, I would like to acknowledge my funding sources, the NIC group and my committee, which always helped me. And then I would like to thank you for having me today, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Fabian, for the interesting talk. Before we get to the discussion started, I would like to gently encourage you to turn on your camera during the discussion period if you are feeling comfortable with it. I believe it'll allow us to have more active discussion period. Thank you very much. So if you have any questions for Fabian, please use the icon, raise hand button, which can be found if you go click reaction icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You will see the raise hand button there. But if you cannot find the button under reaction icon, then or you're using a previous version of Zoom, then please go click participants icon at the bottom of your screen. Then you will find the blue icon labeled as raise hand at the bottom on the right-hand side. If you cannot also find it, please feel free to quickly send me a message via Zoom chat. I'll be then calling you when it's your turn. Now I'll open the seminar to the questions. Yes, Kun, please go ahead.
Thanks, Sangwon. Okay, I still don't understand, Fabian, how it's possible that if you do random selection, you get a better solution compared to doing this inverse layering approach. And one thing I wonder about this inverse layering approach, I just don't understand how it works. Is it true that this has a unique solution or not?
You mean the model, if the model has a unique solution?
Yeah, I mean, if your inverse layering thing has a unique solution.
Oh, so
But to me,
essentially,
this is not. Yeah.
so yeah, essentially, when you give data to a neural network, and in our case, it starts classifying the data, right? It starts populating all its internal neurons with values, essentially, right? And then layer-wise relevance propagation, I like to think of it somewhat as like a gradient descent. I mean, in the furthest way of things, breaks down your final result, and then how important was every previous value to that final result, right? In the previous layer. And in that way, you have a unique solution because the data you first used to populate the neurons comes with a unique solution of layer-wise relevance propagation. Does that make sense?
No, but maybe I'm just too stupid to understand this. But so you're saying, but just for me number wise, so you have 12,000 inputs, right?
Yeah.
And you're saying that, and you have 50 outputs. So I would say that from a just, if I think about this as a linear algebra problem, that's just a many-to-one mapping, which generally will not have a unique solution. So that's why I'm suspicious that it will not have a unique solution. Or is this in this case, this many-to-one mapping does? So let's put it this way: for any value of your 50 outputs, is there a unique input, or are there multiple inputs that map to one value of your 50 outputs?
Say that again, please. For every of my 50 outputs, is there a unique input, or just repeat, please?
Yeah, so are there multiple, well, basically the question is the mapping one-to-one or many-to-one?
You mean one input to many outputs, or?
No, many inputs to one output.
Many inputs to one output. Each step pattern, so each input creates a unique output, right?
Yeah, sure. But is it the case that there are multiple step things that map to this unique output?
Well, it can be that, let's assume you take two steps from the same individual. They would result in the same output if you simply take the maximum value in your output layer, but not if you consider all 50 output nodes, because the output nodes themselves are all a function of a softmax function. So they all sum up to one, right? Each node contributes a certain percentage. And it can be that one input, so one step pattern, creates a solution where your highest value is, let's say, participant 5. And then the second input you have also creates that solution where your highest value is participant 5, but you do have different values for the remaining nodes. So it's a unique solution in that sense.
Sure.
So one-to-one, if you want to say.
Okay.
Now, the intricacy then happens when you go ahead and you basically mask your output and make it a unique solution, in the sense that you set 49 of your 50 output nodes to 0, and you only maintain the value in your highest output node. And then you can create a unique output for multiple inputs. And that's how you would calculate the layer-wise relevance.
Okay, but you agree that this result seems highly unlikely, right? That your random thing. So how is it then possible that your random selection does better than your layer-wise input thing? I just don't see how that's possible if this is a unique mapping.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, just yeah.
So the functional explanation could be that your random selection, and this is what this slide tries to highlight, looks at the entire gait pattern, but only takes glimpses of every, let's say, trajectory or every time percentage, right? And that would mean you basically get a very blurry picture of your entire step pattern, but that might still be enough to get a highly accurate solution. While the other approach, which looks only on very specific variables, might fall short a little bit because you in general have a little bit less of a variance in your input.
Sure.
So that could be the functional explanation. Methodologically, I would say that the relevance maps that I showed today are essentially an average over 1,000 steps. So each step gets its unique relevance map. And then to isolate what is generally important for across all of my 50 participants, I need to average it out. And I think that would basically influence the accuracy that we get if we focus on averaged variables, rather, or on variables that are on average important, but for a unique individual, they might not be the most important one.
I see. So you're saying that if you were to do this procedure for one unique individual, you would expect your relevance map to do better than the random selection.
I mean, I haven't thought about it this way, but yes, I think so.
Okay. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm taking time. I have one very more general question. So I immediately had to think of the movie The Usual Suspects when I listened to your presentation. And I also had to think of the riot that happened last month in the US. Would it be possible, you think, to identify some of these rioters based on their gait pattern using similar techniques? And if so, if I'm ever indicted, would it help if I try to intentionally change my gait when I'm in the police office?
I mean, gait recognition in general is a pretty big topic and a very successful topic in that sense. So yes, it is possible to identify individuals simply based on video footage, right? Like surveillance cameras are already enough to do that. Now, I don't necessarily know how much room for error there is, like how much you would have to change your gait pattern to be, well, let's say anonymous. But there must be some sort of way you can trick the system, right? Like in the end, it's a computer, and computers are generally good at what they do, but they are pretty stupid in that sense. So once you can figure out how to trick the system, I think yes, you could stay anonymous.
Okay, I see Art, you have a question?
Sure, this is kind of related to Kuhn's question, which is about how repeatable everything is. So my question has to do with, normally I'm assuming you're initializing your neural network with random weights. And the result of that is that you can have different neural network weights depending on what they were initialized at, because in general, you kind of expect to end up at a local minimum for the network. And so I do believe what you said about the layer-wise propagation being unique, but I think it's unique for the network. And so my question is, how unique are your networks? If you run this again with a different random initialization, do you get the same network? And then from that, do you get the same relevance variables?
So you're totally correct. You have to kind of control the initial randomization to control for the adjustment of the weights. And that's what we did in all of our codes. So if I run the same code again, I get the same network. And the layer-wise relevance propagation is the same. I did not test different initial randomizations. But I think it goes, like you said, well in line with what Kuhn said. And if we get a different neural network, we get a different result in our relevance scores for sure. And then we would have to see if there's like some general truth in the underlying relevance scores, is what I like to call it. If we just do this a bunch of million times and see what overlaps and what doesn't.
Okay, and then I have another question, which I don't expect is too serious of an answer from, but it seems that your most relevant variables tended to be in, say, the coronal plane, or I thought was really interesting was you seemed not to get much relevance from the sagittal plane. And to me, that's a little bit disappointing, because I think if you look at most biomechanics papers on locomotion, they may plot 3D data, but even if they plot 3D data, almost always the main contributions to, say, the analysis, certainly to the, say, joint powers or joint moments and things like that, almost all of that is, I would say 97% of biomechanics and locomotion is predicated on the sagittal plane. And so do you think biomechanists are just wrong, or other, basically, is the question.
Or other. Well, I had the same question that you posed in the very beginning, and I always explain it in a way where I think that the sagittal plane movements across a large population are more comparable than movements in the coronal and transverse plane. So my hunch was always that there seems to be more variability across people if we look at, like I said, coronal and transverse plane, while the sagittal plane in general would just look more similar. And thus, if our task or our goal is to separate individuals based on their movement patterns, I would expect the sagittal plane to not provide a lot of information, at least in comparison to coronal and transverse.
I see, John, you have a question as well?
Yeah, that point was exactly what I was going to raise, that those bottom two lines on this heat map indicate that those aren't important for individual classification. So I would characterize it as what matters to individual classification are those factors that don't matter to gait function. What would you say about that? The idea being, if they're really important to gait function, then they're constrained, so they can't vary, so they're not going to differ between individuals.
Yeah, I would agree. Well, I think there's a certain solution space in which we operate, right? Let's say we all are bipedal, we all try to move at a certain speed, let's say. So there are certain set parameters where we have very little room to play with. And I think, again, if the task is to tell individuals apart, it would make more sense to look into those parameters where we actually have room to individualize our movement pattern.
Philip, please go ahead if you have any questions.
Okay, so I have a question for your first part of your study. So if I understood correctly, you used the data of day 1 to predict the data of day 2.
Yes, in the broadest way of sense, yeah.
Okay, and so then you were saying that with 96-point-something%, you were able to predict day 2.
Yeah, well, think about it differently. I used the step patterns of day 1 to train the network and set its parameters, but it was not to predict the data of day 2. It was to predict which individual does the step pattern belong to. And then I used the data of day 2 to see if that would be matched to the correct individual.
Okay, and so one point that you kind of put out there was that individuals didn't really change their gait patterns throughout the intervention.
Yeah.
So is that in line what Jen showed in her study?
Yes, Jen showed that her interventions were ineffectual. Is that the word? Yeah, not effective.
Okay, and then have you had a chance to look into those individuals where your network did a bad job or just wasn't appropriate? And were you able to see in like kind of a case series that they changed their pattern in a specific way?
I did not. I looked at some of the raw data, but not of those specific individuals. It was at the beginning of the study because I wanted to see if the raw data looked good. And I did not look at those individuals specifically, so I cannot say.
Okay, thanks.
Greg, please go ahead if you have any questions for our speaker.
Thanks. Yeah, interesting presentation. I wanted to ask a question. So your classification criteria was, did I detect participant A based on training set or based on your training set? And did I, same for A and participant B and C and so on?
Yeah.
So you have highly correlated data, and you're showing that within this highly correlated data, you can use that information to identify the same participant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You would expect that from a neural network, right?
Yeah.
If you train the data and test the data on the same, essentially the same or highly correlated data, then you would get the same result.
Yes.
You also showed that it doesn't seem to be really important what information to include. It can be randomized, and you still find a good solution. So again, that seems to be going toward the idea of just as long as the data is correlated, your classification success rate will be high. So then my question really is, does it really matter if there is a functional component to it, or is it just a matter of correlated data that leads to the successful classification? So is there something functionally that we can really, some information that we can get from this that is meaningful with respect to the statistical approach?
Now, let me reiterate a few of the points you raise. Yes, I think that, well, yes, I expected the network to perform well because it's technically just a nearest neighbor classification. We still have, like, even though the data is collected on 2 different days that are far apart, we have 50 possible answers, and these answers don't change in that sense, right? So you're totally correct. Yes, I would expect it to go well, and clearly it did. Now, is there a functional aspect to, or does it make sense? Sorry, I'm trying to rephrase what you said. Does it make sense functionally? Is there really a functional component in this? I think that we have to be careful what exactly we take away from this. We cannot take away that, like I said, hip up adduction and internal external rotation are generally those trajectories you should look at when you want to separate between people. I don't think that that should be our takeaway, because that is very specific to the model, very specific to the data, like I said. I think the more functional takeaway here is that we need to kind of like narrow down what exactly we want to collect in the lab, especially now with variables and everything. We have the chance to collect a lot of data, and then we get overwhelmed by the many variables that we have that we can look into. And I think from that perspective, this approach holds something functionally in it, because it can direct our studies slightly, and it can kind of narrow down where we should focus. Does that answer the question?
That would bring me back to previous comment about what do we typically look at. And from typically, like when we look at populations with injury or populations with neuromotor deficits, we don't look in the transverse and the coronal planes, we look in the sagittal plane, right? So then again, I guess it depends if you had to redo this, but I guess it gets fundamentally gets more at the question, what do we want to use this information for? And it's for, if it's the information at the moment used for, can we identify the same individual from the training set that clearly works. But if you go back to the beginning of your presentation and talking about identifying people based on differences in sex or injury, you don't have this training set to go with the testing set, right?
Correct.
And so that's a completely different kind of question.
Yes. The results here that I showed were clearly targeted towards an individual identification, and we cannot derive generalized cues as to what would tell males from females or injured from non-injured. Correct.
Thanks.
I see, Ryan, you have a question for our speaker.
Yeah, great talk, really interesting. Please correct me if I'm understanding this wrong, but it seems like for every time series that you include in the model, you're sort of discretizing into some number of points, and then each of those is an input. And then I'm just wondering if you considered an alternative approach of, say, maybe taking that time series and you know, using a regression, say on like a Fourier series or something, right? And then instead of however many n data points you have, maybe a handful of variables associated with that time series. And then, you know, I'm just curious if you think that sort of approach could work, reduce dimensionality. You know, could you speculate about if that maybe the performance of that approach?
Yeah. Well, short answer is for this data set, no, I didn't. Long answer is yes, I thought about that, and I did that on a different data set where I used a principal component analysis to reduce dimensionality, and then a selection of principal components, let's say the first 3 or first 10 represented an entire step pattern. And so first of all, the reason why I didn't do it for this data set, the reason why I didn't reduce it was because I wanted to look into the individual variables. If we were to reduce it, we would then be left with the question of, okay, so we reduced the space to those variables, but what do they actually mean? Especially when we use principal axes and loadings. And in this fashion, we can look at the actual raw data in that sense. But what I learned from the other data sets where I did use a space reduction prior to a neural network is that it works quite as well. It works, it's similarly accurate. I think it makes a lot of sense because you kind of reduce your large data set to less variables that should express more, depending on which technique you use, right? If you use a principal component analysis, you look into variance, so you reduce it to variables that have a high variance. And consequently, a neural network will have a similar, let's say, easy time to classify between individuals. Yeah, for sure.
Arash, please go ahead.
So my question is related to the first quote you said from Shakespeare. So individuals are really good at recognizing people that they know. But one thing is that the sampling frequency of human eye is very low. It's like maybe like 10, 15 hertz. I was wondering if you reduce the sampling frequency in your data, what the result would have been.
Mm-hmm. Like we didn't do this, so I can only speculate, but I would think that as long as you don't go below like a too low of a threshold, like as long as you don't reduce it to, let's say, 1 hertz, you might still get comparable results. From a different study that we did a while back, we looked at Emg signals and we sampled at 2,400 hertz, which was way too much for a neural network because we had like 7 different muscles and so on. There we resampled down to, I believe, 32 frames per muscle, and our neural network had no troubles at all. So I believe data reduction in either way, either by resampling over the temporal scale or by resampling via a different method like variance or independent component analysis, both should result in similar performances.
Thank you.
Walter, please go ahead.
Thanks for interesting talk. I'm going to tell a little story here. My first graduate student, Tony Guimarães, in 1989, was interested in predicting muscle forces from EMG. And so we then went on with this type of study and used cellular automata initially, and then adaptive filtering, then also artificial neural networks. And so we measured in the cat hind limb muscle forces and EMGs, and then used that as input to predict for the same animal or also for other animals that we didn't use as training, and to predict forces, muscle forces from EMG. And I think Hans Avelberg and Ming Lu, they published about 3-4 papers on that. And I think those are still the best individual muscle force predictions in dynamic movement that anybody has ever published. But we gave up. I didn't pursue that any further. And the reason for that is that with these, pattern recognition scheme like the artificial neural network or the cellular automata, we were really good at predicting muscle forces very accurately for a variety of situations, but we had no clue why, because we had a double layer network, with 10 and 20 layers, so less than you, but we saw all the weightings in there, but it had no biological meaning, or it didn't provide me with information why the EMG pattern right at this instant of time would give me that force so accurately. So I felt we had solved a great engineering problem. We were able to predict individual muscle forces really accurately, but we had no insight into the system. And of course, the problem in human work is, in order to train the network, you need some muscle forces as input, and in humans, that's kind of impossible. So how do you feel about that? We know artificial neural networks are fabulous in pattern recognition. I don't think you would have needed to do the study to realize that it would classify people according to Gait parameters really accurately. But where do you go from here, and what does that mean from a scientific point of view, rather than having solved an engineering problem that now you're able to recognize people for which you have a couple of steps as input?
Yeah. First of all, you're correct. Like, neural networks are great at pattern recognition, and we would never be surprised if they do the job good that they were designed for. So that is often a point that is overlooked, I find. In terms of your specific example with the prediction of the muscle forces, if you have, or if you would apply the layer-wise relevance propagation approach to that, you would now find an answer as to why the neural network thought those specific inputs were relevant. You might still be left with the question of, is that generalizable, right? Would that work for a completely different population? And I think that touches exactly on this problem that we have with all the pattern recognition research going on. The main issue is always, can we generalize well to other data sets? And if we were to apply a method like this, would that then tell us something functionally underlying, well, the entire population in that sense? Please, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point, because a very good point, because when we predicted Soleus EMG and Soleus forces to other animals, in the Soleus, it worked really well, but we couldn't use that to then predict forces in the medial gastrocnemius or in the plantaris. But if you use plantaris or medial gastrocnemius forces from one animal, we could predict it really nicely to other animals, but it was very muscle specific, as it was not a generalizable algorithm that now we have EMG data and we can predict muscle forces in any muscle. It was very, very specific to the actual muscle in this particular example.
Yeah, and I think we all have to be very careful with these approaches, right? Like there are a tool we can use in the case of layer-wise relevance propagation. We can get a glimpse of what a specific model thought was important for a specific data. For us as researchers, it's then, well, we would then have to do the extra step and collect a new data set, only focusing on those variables that were important in the first place, and see if they would actually tell us something that we have overlooked in earlier iterations of our research, right? So I don't think we can stop at this point at all. Like there's the next step is then proving or exploring whether or not it tells us something that is actually working.
And just a very technical point, you know, you mentioned that you had these 1200 input nodes with the 1200 variables. The way we did it, you know, we gave in, you know, specific variables because we also gave in kinematics and other things. But we gave it in as a function of time. So we had only about 10 or 12 input nodes, but as a function of time, the data points were coming. And when you put in all 1200 at the input node, how did you recover the time then? Because I thought you had given up looking at time, but then all of a sudden you showed 100 time points there. How did you recover that if you put them all in like at the same time, so to speak?
Yeah, so essentially, if you consider that we had 12 different trajectories, by concatenating them all into one very long array, we would maintain the time information because every node in the neural network is connected to every other node, right? So if there's something important at time point 1 and you have in your long array where you have them all connected, concatenated, sorry, you have time point 1 and time point 101 and then time point 201, they are all connected to the next layer in a large fashion. So the time information is maintained in that sense. And then you can just, once you get the relevance scores, you just reshape your array back into your matrix, in your time-dependent matrix. And that way the time information is maintained.
I was just trying to think about, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago, there was a keynote lecture at the Canadian Society for Biomechanics, and Benno might remember it. That was very similar to what you had done. You know, it was walking patterns, and he was showing happy people and sad people, and male and female, and younger people and older people, and you could recognize very easily if the person was happy or male or female or that type of thing. But it was also interesting because he then showed sagittal views and frontal views. And for example, I remember men and women, you know, the sex differences were hard to identify on the sagittal view, but were absolutely dead obvious, you know, in the frontal view, kind of confirming the types of things that you have found as well.
Yeah.
And just the last thing to your emails, that you didn't receive any emails in 7 days when you were out in the boonies and you had no access to electricity.
No, well, I received nothing. And the reason why I thought that was funny, coming back to the very beginning of the seminar, was simply that I thought we always spend a lot of time online and on social media, and taking a year off, you really fast realize that, you know, once you step out of it, you're gone.
Because I did once the experiment during vacation where I said, I'm not going to write any emails from Monday till Friday. And, you know, I forgot the exact numbers, but on Monday I got 150 emails, and Tuesday I got 100. And then by Friday it was down like to 17, which confirmed to me that the more you email, the more emails you get, and the best thing to do is to not really answer. And then it fizzles out. So that's kind of
Did you publish that, Walter?
I haven't published it yet, you know, but I'm thinking about sending it to Nature Communications. Anyway, it's actually interesting how that works.
Yeah.
But anyway, side issue. Sorry.
I'm
I'm shutting
Colin?
up now. I'm done.
Okay, thank you, Walter. Colin, you have a last question for our speaker?
Okay, thanks for the talk, Fabian. I was interested in more of like the practical sense behind the neural network. So you showed kind of where differences lied in the different planes and stuff from your data set. But practically speaking, if you're doing 3D motion capture, you're going to have to collect all that information anyways. So does it slow down your processing of the neural network or anything to use all 1,200 different inputs, or is it really just a matter of like functionally this is where we probably want to focus our efforts on?
You raised an interesting point there. For these 1,200 variables, it did not make a big difference. Like if I use 200 or 1,200, I still train within maximum of 5 minutes, and I still classify within a maximum of 5 minutes. So there's not a lot of gain there. However, I'm currently working on a data set that was collected using the XSense MVN link system. And from that data set, we obtained, I think, 18 joint angle trajectories, 3-dimensional. And it was collected for Ironman competitors, and they were running a 4-kilometer run. So in total, we have, in that data set, we have like something over 900,000 steps, and each step is expressed by 5,400 variables or something like that. And for a data set like that, it would make a big difference. So currently, it takes me about 8 hours, so an entire night to run one iteration of my data reduction. And I think that removing a bunch of variables from a data set like that would definitely give us a practical benefit, yeah.
And maybe one more, that's pretty interesting actually, but one more add-on to, what about like anthropometric variables and stuff? So just looking at those two pictures initially of the typical male and typical female gait, and what Walter was talking about, like, what if you use like shoulder to hip ratio or something like that? If you had the data, wouldn't that be fairly indicative of classification or no?
I can only speculate, but yes, I would assume so. I mean, again, a neural network, just as any pattern recognition method, will optimize the heck out of your data. It will work for as long as it needs to be as close to your optimal classification there. And I mean, that's a big problem because we have overfitting and things like that. But I think that if your data just slightly, like, has just some information in there in terms of male or female or old or young, the network will find it for the better or for worse. So I can envision anthropometrics being helpful as well, yeah.
Cool, thanks.
On that note, I would like to thank Fabian again for giving great talk. For the next week's seminar, we will be having an invited speaker, Dr. Carl Zelig from Vanderbilt University, and he will be giving a talk which is about researching, developing, and translating wearable assistive technology for sweaty, squishy, and quirky humans. I would like to thank Dr. Eric Arnert for inviting him. Thanks for coming today, and I'll see you next week.